Today we'll be talking about microplastics, their implications on personal health and also environmental sustainability and our own sustainability, because the environment and us are inextricably linked. So we're just going to talk about what the average day for the average American kind of looks like and what exposure we have, what the implications, as I mentioned, are for this exposure. So unbeknownst to us, we have a lot more exposure than many people may realize. So we get up, we brush our teeth, we may shave, we may use shaving gel. I did this morning, for example. May use soap or skin moisturizer, deodorant, some more soap, I suppose. I think that was a shampoo and conditioner. I apologize, up at the top, the gold and the silver. Moisturize, if you got dry skin. I have that on my hands, so I'll use some moisturizer. I don't use lipstick at the moment, but you may use cosmetics. So these are different things that we all, on a typical day, will engage in using. Now, I think the obvious thing to most people is that the packaging, okay, yeah, I get it, packaging is plastic. Everything here is probably encased to some degree in plastic. What I think most people don't realize is that not only is the packaging plastic, but many of the ingredients themselves are plastics. So this generic image of a toothpaste tube, up until 2019, for example, Aquafresh, which is one common brand, most of the Procter & Gamble toothpaste brands, such as Crest, et cetera, used something called microbeads, which were plastics. And that was actually an ingredient in toothpaste to make it glide more smoothly. Now, after 2019, they removed that because people are like, I don't really kind of want to brush my teeth with plastic anymore. But they replaced them with other polymers. So there are PEG polymers, which one thing you can do is actually just take a picture of the ingredients of whatever you're using, run it through ChatGPT and say, is there anything plastic related in the ingredients that you're seeing in this picture? Because ChatGPT will let you do that, and it will give you all the plastic related polymers that are in your consumer packaged goods. So you're going to have microbeads here, you're going to have Teflon on the blade here for most razors. The lubricant is going to have microbeads with these lubricating strips that often are found, and this is an example of a Gillette Fusion. This is full of different types of glycol, polymers, plastics, fancy plastics, but plastics. Your shampoo and conditioner, the way it gives you that silky smooth sheen is not because it's mimicking natural oils and processes, is because it's coating you with a little bit of plastic. And the glide nature of deodorants often is also a function of plastic, and soaps less often, but still some will have plastic. For sure, if you were to take the ingredients of CeraVe or Cetaphil or your more common moisturizers that are dermatologist recommended, you will find that they contain a variety of plastics, often more than one. And this is to give them a few things. One is it offers some shelf stability so that it doesn't degrade, and it also offers that smoothness and sheen. And you see that with makeup as well. In fact, makeup is one of the biggest sources of microplastic exposure, cosmetics in general, for folks in the US and worldwide today. So all of these, not only the packaging has plastic, but the ingredients are also plastic in many or all cases. Of course, there are now brands coming out that try to avoid it, but they're very hard to find. And there's a lot of greenwashing as well to be aware of, which is assertions of healthiness that may not hold up to scrutiny. The other place you're going to find plastic is you get up in the day, you're going to dress, you're going to have a cup of coffee, maybe some tea. In all these cases, this is plastic. Your flannel is not even remotely related to sheep, which is where the term fleece comes from. This is polypropylene typically. It's a type of plastic, same plastic that's used in water bottles, which is why they can recycle these things into fleece jackets and such. Your coffee, typically the filter, and if you use a Keurig pod, those are plastic. Now, one of the worst things you can do is combine plastic and heat, plastic and acid, plastic and oily substances or fat. That exposure to either heat or those other types of substances, acidic substances or fatty substances, is what causes plastic to leach into the food. So coffee is a perfect example. You're going to run something hot through something plastic, and it's going to absorb that plastic material into the coffee itself. And tea, say this was tea for example, is worse because you're going to steep it. If you were to take someone's measurements in terms of phthalates, bisphenols, which are plastic-related chemicals, and we can talk about that in a second here, your urine analysis will show increased levels of those chemicals almost a few hours after you've consumed these beverages. Green tea steeped, that comes in a little bag, whether that bag is paper or mesh, it's probably worse if it's mesh, is almost always still lined with some degree of plastic. So that is being absorbed by you whenever you steep that tea. Tea is actually one of the worst things. You think you're probably doing something healthy by drinking some green tea, but in most cases that green tea is actually one of the worst transmitters of microplastics and cousin chemicals, I'll call them, than almost anything else. So what would seem like a healthy morning ritual can be actually pretty bad for you. Paper cups, especially this one that looks like it's brown paper, looks like it's super green. It is usually white on the inside. The reason paper cups are often white on the inside is because back in the day, before 1950 or so, the way they made paper cups waterproof, or water resistance I should say, is they put something called kaolin clay, it's a type of clay that is white, and they centrifuge the cup, which means they spun it around and they coated the inside of the cups, paper cups, with that clay, which made them water resistant. Now, for a very long time, multiple decades, we've abandoned that. It's a little bit more expensive, and this is coated in plastic. So the inside of a paper cup is basically plastic. It's essentially a plastic cup. So any hot beverage in here is also leaching a tremendous amount of plastic. Again, plastic leaches when it's exposed to heat, acid, and fatty or oily substances. And so in that case, you're talking about some acidity from the tea and heat. So that is not a good way to avoid any microplastic exposure. Now, this is probably not a good meal to begin with, so forget the food for a second, but this metal foil food covering is actually also thinly coated in plastic to give it some oil resistance. Though that cheese against the material, the packaging, the wrap is going to actually leach quite a bit of plastic into the cheese as well. Water bottles, I think you guys have heard of this if you've been watching the news. Water bottles leach plastic into the water at alarming rates. Now, if you leave that plastic water bottle in your car for multiple days in the heat, even worse. I know a lot of people keep a crate of water bottles in their trunk or in their, in their back of their SUV. That heat and the water bottle and the plastic are all leaching plastic into the water. And this is one of the biggest culprits of microplastic ingestion in the US is water, and specifically through water bottles. So, pretty interesting process. Okay, aluminum cans must be safe, right? It's good old aluminum. Aluminum is infinitely recyclable, meaning you can recycle this forever. Well, if you're to put these cans in an acid bath, you'll note when the aluminum melts away, there's some formulations that you can actually have the aluminum dissolve, and what you'll be left with is an inner layer of plastic. So all of these cans are lined in plastic, and they contain a specific substance called BPA, bisphenol A, which is what gives plastics. So let's talk about these cousin chemicals. You may have heard of some of them. Bisphenols, BPA is one example of them, are additives they use when they make plastic and the production of plastic to make plastic soft and clearer. So it gives plastic a certain set of properties. Phthalates make plastic rigid and firm. So you may have heard these phthalates. Another one may be forever chemicals or PFAS. These are used two ways in plastic production. One is to help plastic fall out of the mold, because Teflon is a type of PFAS, as an example. So it helps things from sticking to other things. And so it's used in the production of plastic, and also helps make plastic water resistant. So one application of PFAS is right here, to make that wrapper slick. So if you ever noticed a a wrapper, say from McDonald's, and maybe you guys don't eat there, but you'll notice it has a little bit of a slick property to it to help absorb oil, to keep it from absorbing oil rather. Those are phthalates. Bisphenols give plastic bottles their semi-rigidity and clarity, and phthalates help also give these plastics their rigid properties so that they can stay structurally firm. So what does all that mean? Now, bisphenols, phthalates, etc., all have human health implications. Specifically, bisphenols are estrogenic, and so are, to some degree, phthalates. Bisphenols specifically, being estrogenic, essentially convey properties similar to the female estrogen hormone, which can be pro-inflammatory, which can be pro-carcinogenic, and it has a lot of negative implications. Now, when human fetuses are exposed to this, especially male human fetuses, their development is severely compromised. And this is one of the reasons why the FDA, after many years of knowing this, banned BPA, which is a type of bisphenol, which is estrogenic, in 2012. Now, the truth is that bisphenol has just been replaced by other close cousin chemicals called BPF and BPS, and they have the same behaviors. So the FDA is being sort of scrutinized or cynically viewed as having banned BPA for the purposes of actually preserving the plastic water bottle industry. Now, BPA is banned only for sippy cups and baby bottles. Baby bottles, pretty bad situation because you've got heat when you heat up that baby bottle, you got acidity because the milk has got lactic acid, and you got oils and fats in milk. Worst combination. We're giving babies this enthusiastically for many years. We've kind of stopped. Again, I said that they've just replaced BPA with other things. We'll talk about that in a minute. But you as adults get the pleasure of consuming BPA, which is found in the lining of cans and in these water bottles to this day. There's no change in policy there. So that still occurs. Now, we continue. I think I mentioned before we started the presentation that tire dust is one of the biggest sources of microplastics, and we inhale that. And the friction of these tires against the road throws this up into the air. If you guys live in Palo Alto, we're obviously near 101 and 280. What you'll notice is often on the outside of your home, you may see like a black soot if you run your fingers across like a windowsill or something. Most of that is tire dust, and we're inhaling that. One of the reasons it became under greater scrutiny is because we figured out it was killing fish, and it's probably not doing anything great to us. 60% of the microplastics in the ocean are from runoff, specifically from tire dust, meaning the tire dust accumulates on the roads. When it rains, they wash into the riverways that then end up washing into the oceans and then get absorbed by fish and marine wildlife. So 60% of what's in the ocean is coming from tires. So you may think the worst emission is the tailpipe. We've done a lot to mitigate that. Now it's actually the tires that you see there. The other significant place for microplastics is fabrics. So nothing against the library or anything, but these types of fabrics here are synthetic. The carpet is. All this is kicking up dust. You mentioned the microfiber rag. You can see very clearly that it leaves behind thousands of little particles. They look like little tiny fibers. You also have that come out in the wash. Every time you run the laundry, a lot of this effluent is basically generating tons and tons of these microplastic fibers, and they end up in the waterway, but they also end up in the air. They're just kicked up through natural processes of friction into the air where we inhale them. And as I mentioned before, and folks were here in the room at the time, our bodies are decent at expelling certain types of foreign objects from our lungs. Sand, for example, soot, other things that get into our lungs typically degrade because they're organic. However, these microfiber microplastics, like polyester particles, etc., are tough for the cilia, the little hairs in our lungs that push things out from the deepest parts of our lungs, have a hard time grabbing onto these fibers, and they tend to stay and cause longer term irritation. So this is one reason why these things are a problem from the perspective we haven't really been evolved to handle them the way we have other foreign particles and pollutants. And finally, the ubiquitous to-go container. Now, this specific container, you'll notice, is made of black plastic. That is now in the news if you were to Google it today. Black plastic is known to be especially problematic because it's full of those chemicals called phthalates, and it's often recycled plastic from consumer electronics. Because black, you can mix all sorts of things together and you don't have to really worry about the color or the clarity. And so this black plastic typically has the worst types of recycled plastic that has the most chemicals. Now, ironically, that's the stuff we put our food in, that's the stuff we stick in the microwave to reheat the food, etc., and all that gets absorbed. So all of this is shedding or leaching plastic into things that we're consuming and putting into our bodies. So that was the day. We ended up starting the day with brushing our teeth, doing our normal morning routine, soaking ourselves in microplastics that we didn't even know we were doing, and then throughout the day we were eating, driving, working in our desks or offices and in our homes, absorbing microplastics left and right. And the day draws to a close. So at the end of the day, I think we mentioned this earlier, we consume about a credit card's worth of plastic every week. That's how much plastic it's estimated the average American consumes. So that's a deck of cards over the course of a year, 52. Every week. There's an interesting study, just as an aside, this is a little bit indelicate, but there's a man in Nebraska, I believe, who went to the University of Nebraska. He, for 1 month, ate very cleanly, followed all the sort of the prescriptions of how to avoid plastic. And they did a special type of test with him with the lab at the University of Nebraska, where they took his stool samples for the course of the month. And then he ate normally, as a typical American would. Had some fast food, but not over the top. I think the worst thing he did was heat up some cup of ramen in the styrofoam bowl it came in. I think that was the most egregious thing he did. And they took samples of his stool for another month, and they centrifuged them down. What was a little shocking to me that I didn't see coming was that with the naked eye, you could actually see the plastic. It wasn't some, got to dial in a microscope. You could literally see the sediment of plastic that they had isolated. So that's the thing that made me feel like this probably wasn't super hyperbolic. That there's some credence, this wasn't just a researcher trying to get some notoriety. There is some, and I think the people who wrote the study that really encapsulated this will concede this is probably on the high end. If you're eating fast food regularly, you're drinking a lot of water out of water bottles, etc. There's a certain lifestyle, but it's not one that's crazy that will lead to this. But even if you're eating half a credit card a week, probably not great. Now, the good thing is that our bodies will generally handle most of these microplastics, either through our liver or kidney or other digestive system. We expel a ton of these. The key is to not overload those processes, which we often do, such that there's no other place for it to go than our bodies. And we'll talk about that in a second. So the good thing is our bodies have the capabilities to handle at least some tolerable degree. Otherwise, we would not have evolved to this point, if we weren't able to deal with certain toxins. But once we overwhelm that capacity, no good things happen. So look at air. It's mostly dust and synthetic fabrics that we inhale, pollutants that are more than just tailpipe emissions and typical industrial pollutants. It's actually that tire dust I was mentioning before. Food and drink, it's one of the biggest sources in water specifically. Our water is full of microplastics. PFAS specifically, which is one of those cousin chemicals used in the production of plastic. And I should make sure to point out now is that I mentioned bisphenols, these forever chemicals often called PFASs, phthalates, etc. They're used in the production of plastic. They can be detected very easily, in the urine, other blood tests, etc. The microplastics themselves are often a vehicle to transmit these chemicals. What the microplastics do versus what these chemicals do are two separate things. The chemicals actually we know do very bad things today, where the studies are in that we don't have to wonder. The smoke is now fire. The plastics themselves, we're just now learning what they do. So for example, we're finding it in the human brain, I think in some cases they said 0.5% of the average human brain is plastic now. A lot of arterial plaque contains microplastics today. So these are all things that are emerging, and we'll learn the implications of these over time. But those chemicals I mentioned that plastic is a carrier vehicle for, or is used in the production of plastic, we already know. The studies are in with regard to their implications. And of course, those topical products like makeup was the biggest one. 8% of what we put on our bodies, our skin absorbs, and so that ends up into our bloodstream, and then our kidneys and liver, et cetera, have to try to deal with. So, just in a little bit more detail, this is sometimes people glaze over with this. These are the specific numbers. So these are the number of particles, et cetera, that in grams that we absorb through those different mechanisms. So inhalation, ingestion, absorption. These are the places where this sort of happens. These are the vehicles by which this takes place. So, as I mentioned, your kidneys, your liver, your digestive system can deal with some of these at some tolerable level, but if you do more than your body can normally handle, you will either, for example, gain weight if you eat too much, and if you take on too much microplastic, the body's normal mechanisms cannot handle them, cannot expel them to any appreciable degree, and you end up absorbing them into your body. And so they go places. So for example, they're in our digestive tract. They're in our endocrine system from the perspective they are altering our hormones. So we'll talk about that more in a few minutes, but essentially these are estrogenic chemicals by and large, and they do alter our hormones. They're in our nervous system. I mentioned they're in our brain. They're in our reproductive system. 100% now, not to be indelicate again, male testicles and male sexual organs have been found to have microplastics in them. This was not the case 10 to 15 years ago. This is a relatively modern phenomenon. And it's been a progression, but in 2010, this was not the case. In 2022, it's 100% of the samples have this issue. It's in our respiratory system, in our urinary system, and as I mentioned, the coronary plaque is full of microplastics these days. And people who have plastics in their coronary plaque, their clogged arteries, if you will, have a higher rate of essentially cardiac events. The chances of having a heart attack that will kill you goes up by 60%. So there are implications that we are being sort of discovered as the data comes in. A few obvious ones, again, I mentioned the FDA banned the use of certain chemicals with the production of plastics, BPA specifically in 2012, and that was because they were noticing that male fetuses were exhibiting developmental issues, specifically androgenic ones, such that their sort of sex characteristics were being altered. And that was because essentially we were injecting estrogen into a developing male fetus. Now it has implications on female fetuses too, but these were more stark. And specifically, we've seen an impact on fertility and other indicators later in life as well. Now in the same period, we're seeing increased risk of certain cancers, especially breast cancer among women at younger ages, which we haven't seen before. So all of these are correlated, but not firmly causatively related. We're still learning more over time. And so we'll look at some of these statistics. So this is a graph of plastic production over the course of the last 50 years and where it's anticipated to go. But you'll see that there's been a massive increase over the last 20 years, more recently. And that's because a lot of the developing world is now developed, come online, living lifestyles like ours, where plastic is a dominant material in everyday life. So there's just a massive amount of plastic in the world by a massive number of people, leading to a lot of this floating around. And we only, as a global community, recycle about 9% of plastic. Most of it is burned or thrown in landfill or ends up in the ocean. So very little plastic is recycled. It just doesn't happen. And even if you did recycle plastic, the Japanese are great at it, 80% recycling rates, whereas we are about 6% in the US. Even if you did that, you can only recycle the typical plastic material 5 times before it degrades. It can't be recycled forever. It's not what we call infinitely recyclable. Infinitely recyclable materials are metals, glass, certain papers, but plastic is not one of them. It cannot be forever recycled. You have a finite number of cycles that it can go through the recycling process. So during this period, 2000 to 2020, we went from never seeing microplastics in human breast milk and placenta to now seeing it 100% of the time. If you were to sample most pregnant women today versus in 2012, 100% of placenta will have microplastics in them, 100% of breast milk will have microplastics. And back in 2012, it was about 40%, 2005, it was close to 0%. So this rise in microplastic presence in our bodies and our environment is a function of just making a lot more of the stuff, and it's become much more ubiquitous. We're finding it everywhere. But we've been producing it for 100 years. And I should take the moment to say that plastics aren't evil. They're actually very useful substances. They just shouldn't be done or used for everything all the time, because there are implications of doing that, which we're now understanding. Plastics help get rid of the ivory trade by substituting ivory billiard balls with plastic ones. They help get rid of tortoiseshell glasses by substituting tortoiseshell glasses with plastic ones. So there's been some good from plastic, and there will be. It's just the degree to which we're relying on it. A side conspiratorial note, the petrochemical industry, as they see sales of oil for transport and other purposes go down, this is a natural alternative because plastic is made out of petroleum. So this is an alternative market that very publicly they have said this is what they want to pursue. So what are the implications? This is more correlation than causation, but there are certain models that we've established that link autism to the increased prevalence of some of the chemicals we've talked about. And it's gone from when my son was born, of 1 in 78 children had autism, to now 1 in 36. That's just in the last decade. So we can argue that the detection has improved, but I think autism as a disorder has been known for a very long time, and I don't think all of it can be just ascribed to we're better at finding it. The other thing is, I mentioned before, breast cancer is on the rise among younger women, and estrogen obviously is elevated levels of estrogen actually promote this type of cancer, so this is something we're starting to see. The other fairly stark change is in men. The average level of serum testosterone has dropped by 30% in the last 20 years in the whole population. So has fertility among men in terms of sperm motility and mobility, other factors that are used to determine fertility in general. So this is kind of a crash that's happened over the last 20 years that probably isn't talked about enough. Now, we mentioned before, what are some of the obvious things we can do to make some changes? I'll do some examples and then get into some specific steps. Morning rituals, tea, go with loose leaf tea versus these bagged teas that you can see. That one is just basically a plastic tea bag, maybe wrapped in some beautiful packaging to make you think it's wonderful and healthy, but it is not contributing to your health in any way. Coffee, best to grind your own beans if you can and enjoy it fresh, versus these pods, which when heated, the plastic pod themselves are emitting microplastics or transmitting microplastics into the coffee. So one of the things that you can notice here is that this is new school, this is old school. Typically anything quote unquote old school is not a bad way to go. It's worked for a reason. We probably never needed to change. And one of the things I think I observe is that we intuitively know already what's good for us. We can feel it. When we see it, we know it. So this is a wood cutting board versus what you may see here, which is a plastic one. Which one would you rather use? Which one would you rather be around? And I think our bodies somatically kind of already know this feels right. This is very elemental. This is not. Now that's not scientific, that's notional, but I think there's something to it. We know what we like, and we like it for a reason. Our evolutionary minds know what we have preferences for. So the other key point is we know that what is good for us is probably also good for the world. All right, so we talked about this already. So let's jump into steps we can take. One is removing some of the chemicals. Most of the US water supply has higher levels of PFAS than the government now is even comfortable with. So the government is now working on coming up with new guidelines for PFAS. Those will be out in 2026. In the meantime, how can you remove those? Reverse osmosis filters, above counter, below the counter, are very good ways of removing these PFAS. Ironically, the filters are made of plastic, but they get rid of more plastic than they transmit. So for now, that's a good thing. They are coming out with new non-plastic filters that are made out of ceramic, but those are a little rare to find, but they are out there if you look for them. So that's one thing you can do. Watch what you drink and filter it, because this is one of the biggest sources of microplastic ingestion today, because wastewater management systems were never designed to filter this stuff out. So they don't. When you're drinking water, don't use this, don't use the box. The box is simply lined with plastic. There are some aluminum cans that will say that they're not lined with plastic, they're lined with, we talked about aluminum cans. These are often, will say they're lined with plant-based liners. So you can look for those. And then filtered water with your own water bottle, which I think most people are doing these days already. Then watch what you breathe. I'll just go through this pretty quickly. A good air purifier is pretty valuable, especially in a room like this where you have synthetic carpeting, synthetic furniture. These are ones I recommend simply because the filters don't have to be changed once but every 5 years. If you have to maintain it very aggressively, you have a busy life, you're not going to do it, it's going to be pointless. So opt for ones that are higher quality, that require less intervention, that just, literally this particular one, you can see it's very simple, it just has an on-off switch. The instructions literally say, turn this on and remember to look at it 5 years from now. That's better. Now, most of your cars these days will also have a HEPA filter. If it doesn't, you can actually have one added. You can put one in your office if you'd like to. Typically, water filters and air filters have the same concept. They do two things. In the case of air filters, they use HEPA, which is a type of filtration media that was meant to take out viruses and bacteria, but it's great with particles as well. And it also will contain not only that filter, which traps particles, actual material that's in the air, but then you also have certain noxious gases. And often these filters will have something else, usually something called activated carbon, which binds to these other chemicals that are not materials, they're actually gases, so they pass through any kind of filtration. So this are always two parts. There's usually a particle media, like a HEPA filter, and then activated carbon to suck out and bind with gases and molecules that are floating around. In the case of water, it's usually a reverse osmosis filter and also activated charcoal. Activated charcoal has been known to be a filter for over 1,000 years, and we still use it. So again, some of that old school stuff really works. Some other options, and I'll make this, this obviously will be recorded, but these are other filtration options that are great for air. The other thing you can do is clean regularly to get some of those particles that are already loose from getting in the air in the first place. This seems a little hokey in the sense of how much can this really have an impact. They've done some studies at a few universities where this does actually reduce the amount of microplastics floating in the air in any given room, just the act of cleaning regularly, weekly specifically. And then the other option is just to opt for natural fabrics. They're harder to find. It's very hard to find a natural fabric sofa or furniture, but they are out there. The other thing is watch what you wear. If you look at the fleece here, jacket that we talked about before, that's one thing. But this picture here, anyone want to guess what that is? Those are discarded garments in the Andes mountains that are seen from space. And these are garments that were never worn. They simply didn't hit the fashion cycle. You notice how they're gray. And gray wear is usually the material that they use before they dye something a certain color. And so that's gray wear material that basically was deemed to be out of fashion as soon as it was produced. And it was sent to South America to be thrown away in the Andes. And you can literally see it from space. So all this stuff is actually, churning microplastics into the environment. So don't wear that stuff. If you want to look for natural fibers, these are examples. There's plenty of them that we've forgotten about. We don't wear much linen anymore. We don't wear much hemp. Bamboo linen is great. You can actually get cork clothing. Cotton obviously is always a winner. The interesting thing with bamboo linen, is bamboo can be made to feel like polyester if you really want, and it can also be made to feel like silk. In fact, if you look at bamboo silk, it costs about as much as silk because it's not easy to make, but it's pretty luxurious. But there's a ton of things that are alternatives to what we use today. We just have forgotten about. The other thing is leather. Some people may have some issues with that, but those are options. This particular fleece here is made out of cashmere. So it's going to be a little spendier. That's probably $75 versus maybe $25 that you'd get for something made out of polyester. But there are now plenty of clothing lines that have emerged that make natural fiber clothes, and that's all they make. So you can find full cotton, cashmere, linen lines now on the internet. And then I think we talked about this, so I'll skip over that. And then this is hard to avoid, but limit your exposure. So these are not great. Get them into glass or your own containers as quickly as possible. These squishy to-go containers, don't ever heat anything up in there. Those are some of the worst you can expose yourself to, and the others are not any, much better. But these two are pretty bad. This, what looks like metal or aluminum, is actually lined with plastic. This we already talked about is lined with plastic as well, even though it looks like paper. And the paper cup is essentially a paper outside with a plastic inside. Now I have that clamshell up in the right corner. That is interesting simply because if you remember going to the grocery store 5 to 10 years ago, strawberries and whatnot would always come in a cardboard or paper box, small little box, maybe there was plastic over it. This during the pandemic became a big thing. Probably didn't even realize it, but most produce is now packed in those clamshells because the petroleum industry needed to find other ways of selling petroleum. And so they basically priced lower than paper and now have undercut all the paper packaging that you'd find in the produce aisle even. So alternatives, just hand out a few here. Glass, which is great and easy to find. This is Pyrex. Anchor Hawking is another great brand. Or you can just use mason jars. They're wonderful. Here, there's steel, and then wood is great from a cooking perspective. The bottom there is silicone. Silicone has its own issues, but compared to plastic, much more health friendly and environmentally friendly. After 450 degrees, when you get silicone hotter than that, certain types of silicone, you can have some chemical leaching, but it's very resistant to leaching any chemicals and up until that point. So it's a good alternative to plastic. Silicone is not made out of petroleum as plastics are. A few other things that we talked about before. Plastic cutting boards, not a great move. You can get wood, you can even get metal, you can even get glass. Wood is my preference. So that's another thing you can do to avoid microplastics. If you ever look at a plastic cutting board, after you used it for like a year or so, you can see it's completely scuffed up and scratched, and that plastic is making its way into your body in big pieces. So a couple other quick things. When it comes to cookware, there's nothing like cast iron or its close cousin, carbon steel. The French love carbon steel. As Americans, this is often more popular. The French also like enameled cast iron. And then a few other quirky options. Stainless steel is pretty common. But two quirky options are the old school copper, tin line copper, which is expensive but really great. This can be virtually non-stick or very close to non-stick. It's never going to be quite Teflon, but pretty close. Tin lined copper. The tin is naturally stick resistant, and seasoned cast iron is as well. The one that's probably least popular is glass. Now these two don't work on induction. Glass used to be popular in the 70s. You can tell by that color. Not so much now, but some people do like it because they can see the food from all angles. Let's see. Also, stop wearing certain substances, certain makeups, etc. Now, you can find makeups and cosmetics in general that are free of these chemicals. There are now brands that are devoted exclusively to this. And again, if you just take a picture of the ingredients in any of your consumer packaged goods, run it through ChatGPT and ask it, what in here is plastic or plastic related? It will tell you. And you can find brands that do not have that type of material inside it. I think Native is one brand that I'd recommend. There's a few others, but there are many, many coming out, almost every day because this is being recognized as an issue. A couple other quick things, then we do some Q&A, are if you really wanted to, there are ways you can test your microplastic and related chemical exposure. Million Markers, one test example. There's a company out in Berkeley that you can send a urine sample to, and they'll come back and tell you what your chemical load is in your body, if anyone was so curious. So that is the last step for someone who's hardcore, wants to really know. But I think one of the things that's heartening is that in the example I gave before, the man who had a clean month and a not so clean month, there was a big difference between how much plastic was getting into his body. So we know that these simple interventions that we talked about here make a big impact. So those are simple things that you can do right now. I'll mention that I have started a company that focuses on actually doing this on a room-by-room basis. So if someone wanted to do a transformation, they certainly can do that, working with us. I'll leave some cards here. But I want to now kind of leave it open to you guys to see if you have any questions based on what you've heard here today, because I know we have about 10 minutes left. One of the things we do also, I should just mention, is for products, we actually, if you go to our website, we'll indicate for each product the cost of savings of using that product, because typically these non-plastic products have a longer lifespan. They will typically outlive you, like that cast iron. One of the things I think is fascinating, whenever I speak to anyone from the South, especially the South, and they talk about cast iron, they will have their grandmother's cast iron pan from like the 1920s. Almost happens every time. So we calculate what the savings are, how much plastic you'll avoid. So one of the things that's interesting with just this simple example of the cooking pan is we were using nonstick pans before. We seem to be going through them every year. It would stop being nonstick. And I would always blame my wife for using metal utensil, and she's like, no, I'm using your wood ones. Stop blaming me. And what we discovered was that they're inherently disposable. Those pans, if you use them regularly, are not meant to last very long. In fact, if you look on their websites, they'll say 2 to 3 years is the typical lifespan. For us, it was even shorter. So this, in contrast, will last multiple generations. So the good old stuff is built to not, end up in a landfill. One of the things I also find, so we look at how much you'll save, how much plastic you'll avoid, and how many chemicals you'll avoid for all these products. If you visit our website, we have that analysis for all these products that are out, that are commonly used by consumers. One of the things that I think is also interesting is that many of the things that are better for us are things we used to do and we had institutional knowledge around, but have sort of lost. So most people may not even remember how to season cast iron to make it nonstick. That's stuff that we cover, but it's a simple act of plastic made everything so convenient. We adopted it enthusiastically, and now we're learning the implications of that adoption. So I'll leave some business cards, but now I'll leave it open for Q&A. Any questions from the audience? Anything you guys, observe in your personal life that you've thought about and, had questions around? Sure.
What about Brita filters? Those are activated charcoal, I believe.
Yeah, so Brita filters, especially like the pitcher,
Yeah.
they're not bad. They have activated charcoal, but they don't remove a significant amount of PFAS. I think Brita is coming out, because this is a market opportunity for them, they are coming out with a better pitcher filter. The problem with pitcher filters is you have to wait a while if you have a hardcore sort of filter that can address PFAS, the rate at which it will take the input water and turn it into the filtered water is longer. So that's the product trade-off that they have to deal with. But if you're willing to wait, it's fine. Now, the one I would recommend in terms of like a pitcher type of water filtration, as opposed to reverse osmosis, requires power, it's energy, is going to be one that's originated in the UK. It's Berkey. There's one that Berkey's based in Austin. There's Berkfeld, or Field, sorry, that's based in the UK. Similar name, similar look to the product. I'd recommend the one that's from the UK. The one from the UK uses diatomaceous clay, and that does the filtration. Now, they have a fascinating story in that they discovered this water filtration technique during the plague, or it wasn't the plague, but it was a public pathogen outbreak in the early 1800s. And a doctor discovered if you run the water through this clay, people don't get sick. And they implemented it at the various wells around London. And so diatomaceous clay is the fossilized remains of phytoplankton. And so it's a great filtration media. And it has been found by the UK government, it's been certified to remove PFAS. So those are really good water filters. They aren't as convenient as a pitcher that you can stick in the fridge, though. They're usually stand filters, but they don't require power. So they're good.
Or installing something.
Or you don't have to install anything, yeah. There's no plumbing or any kind of work that has to be done. They just stay on the counter. The Britters are great because they can put them in the fridge, right? Now, that brings up the question, should you put a filter on taps, in the bathroom and on the shower heads? You can. Activate charcoal will do some good. It just is, I think it has a 60% reduction rate versus like 99% reduction rate, so it's better than nothing. But your more critical need is on cooking water and drinking water, which is going to typically be at the kitchen sink. And the same thing with air. Your bedroom's probably so a lot of times you'll get air filters that'll say 2,000 square feet or 1,500 square feet. I would just ignore all those kinds of marketing or promotional messages. Just assume no air filter can do anything more than about 500 square feet, 600 maybe. So this is about the size of this room. This is about a 500 square foot room. And so the reason is if I stick that air filter over here, any corner, maybe in the middle of the room, it can really only grab air from so far before it's just starting to grab the same air over and over again. So even if they say this is a 1,700 or 2,000 square foot living space filter, never assume it's more than 500 to 600 square feet. So the best strategy is to have multiple filters at the home. Any other questions? Yeah, sure, thanks.
What about construction material? So we went on, like in drinking water pipes. Mm-hmm. We went away from lead solder to whatever we use now. There's like copper pipes that come in. And at some point, I believe in your house, there's plastic pipes.
PVC is not great, PVC pipes. They're not great. Lead is interesting because we've known lead is bad since the Roman times. There's Roman architects who quote that don't line the aqueducts with lead. They were overruled for financial considerations even then, right? And the U.S. only banned lead in '84. So 2,000 years of history. This is 36 BC to 1984. A lot of history went by before we did something, profound about it. You're correct. A lot of homes in this area will either have galvanized steel or copper or PVC. PVC being the worst out of those options for the reasons we've talked about. Polyvinyl chloride is one of the worst plastics ever. So it's sad that we use it for water. If your home already has it, there's not anything cheap you can do about it. I personally had galvanized steel. We ended up replacing it with copper by running it over the roof. We have an Eichler type of home, so it's a slab foundation. But yeah, in general, PVC is not great. And it's pretty common. In fact, after 1990, the late 80s, it became kind of a dominant piping.
Those are your only options to do reverse osmosis at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because the city water often does not come in PVC. It often comes in either steel or copper or something else. And then, not always, sometimes it is PVC, but then once it's in the home, you can actually on the outside of your home tell, because you'll see that white PVC pipe and you'll know that's plastic. And probably the rest of the home is plastic. Yeah. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.